Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented within the housing sector. This series is all around sharing a collective knowledge within the sector. You can find us on either our LinkedIn page or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host Chris Kinnear, and our guest for this podcast is the ever practical Tony Bamber, who is the account director at Complete Technology Group. Hi Tony, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, always a pleasure. Never
So,
been called practical like that before, but thank you.
from our time together, 100% practical. So first of all, how are you involved in housing and or geospatial?
Mainly in housing, from my perspective. So I work at CTG, who work with social housing landlords and have done for about 4 years now. CTG's been around 5.5 years. So mainly working with housing associations around fibre, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute.
Well, that's exactly going to be. So, just for kind of clarity with our audience, Tony and I used to work together at Complete Technology Group. But for the audience, can you tell us more about what it is and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So CTG, really basic business, started about, as I say, 5.5 years ago. And it was all around what was happening in blocks of flats, what we call MDUs, multi-dwelling units. And it was an audit service, which was free to landlords. So if any provider was going to go in and install fibre into a block, we would be part of that process. So checking off the route design, etc., making sure all the accreditations were correct and the route looked practicable and sensible, and then do a post-build audit of the installation, and then give a digital asset record to the landlord. So making sure the fire stopping was done right, the labelling and everything else that needed to be done. And if there's anything wrong, we would go back to the provider and make sure that they go back and put it right. So CTG was the core business, and then that evolved into a separate entity called Complete Fibre. Complete Fibre in its own right is an infrastructure installer. So what would happen is that if a landlord particularly wanted to use Complete Fibre for any of their MDUs, then they install what we like to call a plug and play infrastructure, which means that the install is done once, and then any provider can then come along and connect into that infrastructure. So rather than multiple providers all installing into the same building with the risks and issues that there are, it's a plug and play, basically. And then there is an evolution in the business, which is Complete Energy Group, which is then going into the world of energy usage, monitoring, and PPAs. So, yeah.
Okay, so lots going on there, and we'll talk more about the auditing and the Complete Fibre products later. But there's one thing that I think is really important from your guys' perspective is building safety. Now, that's a huge component of what you do, and it's really recognised within your culture, and you are a BSF champion at the same time. Can you tell us what the BSF champion scheme is and how you became a part of it?
Yeah, sure. So it's Building a Safer Future is BSF, what it stands for. And it was a very long, in-depth process. And actually, we had a whole project team set up for it. So you have to become a signatory of it first. And the idea is post-Grenfell and making sure that there was a culture and leadership in safety within businesses. So we became a signatory, and then we wanted to go on the champion journey. And there are only 16, maybe 17 as of recently, companies in the UK that are actually BSF champions. And the very first stage of it, which was actually an interesting part, was they wanted to engage with the staff at all levels on their values, what they view as safety in organisations, the processes that are in place, and went in a really in-depth questionnaire and then got feedback from there. But then into there, you then have the actual validation of your processes, the leadership. It's a really in-depth process that lasted probably about 9 months to 12 months to actually get the accreditation. And a lot of hard work went across the business to get it. And then you, at the end of that, hopefully if you're successful, you get championship status, and then you enter into a continuous improvement plan. And that's where they always say, celebrate the reds, which in a lot of ways, music to my ears is it's great that you're green in certain areas, but where you've got reds, it's making sure that you're doing something to improve those red areas. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? So the whole point was to get somebody to externally validate us as a business. So it's all well and good saying, we're independent auditors or complete fiber installing to a certain standard or whatever it might be. But without somebody coming along and giving some validation to you as a business, it felt like it was the right approach for us to make sure we were doing the right things, and actually somebody to come along and say, yes, we've reviewed all your processes and there's some learning points, absolutely, but you're on the right journey and we're here to support you in that. And to be fair to BSF, they were brilliant in the journey and still are in our continuous support. So we've done webinars with them and continue to do events, and it's been a really worthwhile journey, and we learned a lot, and we work well in partnership. So we were delighted to be one of 16 stroke maybe 17 now companies, but and we're the only telecommunications company in the UK to have it.
And I think that's really key, the fact that you're the only telecommunications company within this. We're going to chat about something quite big and quite serious for a moment, is Complete Technology Group. You were born basically out of the building safety and after Grenfell and things, and building safety and fibre installation, because of the audit work that was originally done by one of the founders. What were those challenges that was found, which is why Complete Technology Group began, and how has the telecoms market changed in response to building safety and aspects?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a lot of the time with fibre especially, it kind of went under the what's the right phrase, Chris? You'll correct me. Under the radar, right? And it's because people are busy. There's always priorities within every business, and it goes with housing associations and local authorities. There are priorities, and fibre used to be one of those things that you would just go, yeah, okay, go in. We need fibre. They want full fibre. The residents need it. The building gets upgraded. Brilliant. It wasn't until there was a sort of independent audit function, and CTG is one of a few that offer that service, but it was the actual review of what was going on in those buildings that you suddenly start to realize it isn't just putting a cable in, that actually with penetrating through firebat or penetrating certain areas and walls and everything else, and also the labeling for golden thread purposes to make sure who had been in the building, the right clipping being used. It was it wasn't always the best standard, let's put it that way, and it wasn't any particular individual provider. It was a widespread problem, and I think it was an issue not at provider level. I don't think anyone ever wanted to go in and do a quick job, or not fire stop properly, or it wasn't that as the culture. It was because that in a market where you've got contractors, subcontractors, subcontractors, it is difficult where there are jobs allocated to keep a track of that. And that's where I think we're trying to be the middle ground between landlords and providers. Is look, we know that providers are trying to access buildings, and we know that you want to get the job done in a cost-effective way, while doing the right thing. And that's where we kind of play that middle role, where we say, look, we'll look at the route design, and actually from our perspective, what we want to do is help smooth out the journey. We want to speed things up for landlords and for telcos. So route design has always been a problem with landlords because nobody has a resource to do it. There aren't many fibre teams within landlords anymore, or never existed. So our role there is to go, look, we'll review this, and then we'll make sure it's okay, and we'll give it to you if you're happy with the feedback to sign it off. So we want to help that process. We want to smooth out that process and give some SLAs around getting it signed off from the landlord perspective. But comes with that, once you're actually on site and doing the build, we are going to come and do 100% physical post-build audit of what you've done. So every building that's installed, we have auditors that will go and actually physically go to the building, take all the pictures of penetrations, and make sure it's all compliant. So has it changed? I would love to say it's 100% right first time, Chris. I don't think we're quite there yet, and I don't think anyone would say that they're 100% perfect. I think with our involvement, I think there's an awareness that the standards have to be there, otherwise, they're going to end up going back again anyway. So the audit fail rate a couple of years ago was about 50% of audits, so failing for fire stopping or
As
failing
in
or
50%.
50, yeah, 50, yeah,
And
five
it's
zero.
probably at a similar level today of passes or failures, or has it improved a little bit?
I'd say it's improved a little bit actually. I think we'll come on to this, but it's a different market to where we were a couple of years ago. I think, people aren't building as much because money is scarce in the market, and yeah, we're not seeing the volume of audits coming through because there isn't the volume of builds going on. But the standard, yeah, I would say slightly improved if anything, but we're still a bit away from where we would like to be.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing some of the audits and builds and just seeing, because the challenge as well is when you've got your MDUs, if you've got multiple providers in the building, they've potentially done all their own bits as well, which is quite a scary thought. And um, one thing that I was surprised at was when the law changed a couple of years ago, which was the 30 days notice.
Mm-hmm.
So asking for a way leave, and if a landlord hasn't approved, then it's taken assumption that it's given.
Mm-hmm.
That was quite a scary thing from coming from a housing background.
Yeah,
You know.
it was an interesting legislation, and I can see why it was brought in a lot of respects, because I think there's always been an argument from providers that one of the main blockers is way leaves, and I can see their frustration. Okay, because it is a slow process, but it isn't necessarily the landlord that is holding it up, and there's not a willingness to hold it up. It is sometimes that way leaves get referred to third parties. So you have a lawyer over here who will review it on behalf of the housing association. The likelihood of it being agreed within days is unlikely,
Yeah.
more like months, right? Um, and the other thing the legislation didn't really think about is even if you left it 30 days and then you wanted to enact it, it it isn't really the core basis for an ongoing relationship with the landlord. If your one interaction is, oh, okay, I've waited 30 days and now I'm going to try and enact the legislation, I'm going to go and do what I want. Well, you may get into one building or 5 buildings, but a way leave, although important, is essentially a piece of paper, because without a route design and the permit off the back of that being signed, you shouldn't really be on site anyway. So getting the way leave is one step, but there's more steps to it than that. So the roundabout answer, Chris, is I understood it was meant to smooth out the process, but there was, like ever, it's complicated industry, and I think it was meant in the right way from some respects, but I don't think it's really taken into action yet.
Yeah, and that was, I think, the idea behind Complete Fibre as the product, wasn't it? It was the single install. You didn't have multiple people coming in, and it should just be the case of telcos can just plug and play, as he said, and it means you've got safe installations with fireproofing and everything else.
Yeah, so complete. The whole idea was that certainly in the CTG days, and it still happens, there was one particular landlord who will remain nameless that had, I think it was about 17 providers all sending different wayleaves for different buildings in random locations. So you can imagine 17 different versions of a piece of paper needing to be reviewed, probably by their legal team or external legal counsel. That in itself is a logistical nightmare. So I think part of the benefit for Complete Fibre, and it is a complete optional if landlords want to do it, is you have one wayleave that is standard, 95% City of London, and it's just got a sharing right in there, so that if a landlord wanted to use Complete Fibre, they sign one wayleave, has sharing rights, so that other providers can then use it to then connect to Complete Fibre's infrastructure. So it was just one of the things that was a pain in landlords' world of having multiple wayleave requests coming in for random buildings from different providers in slightly different worded documents. It was just one of the things. But as you say, then it comes on to getting one type of route design. So they will be slightly different because of the buildings, obviously, but one style that you know exactly what you're looking at, and then it's one installation, and then it's one audit, independent audit at the end. So it's the whole golden thread, isn't it, of having, from start to finish, a concise documentation of what's gone in the building from wayleave to the audit report at the end.
Yeah, because I was surprised when we first worked together about how often a landlord might be in a building without knowledge. No, how often a telco would be in a building without knowledge. And that was quite scary, seeing how common that was from just a building safety perspective.
Yeah, and it's been a topic of hot debate over many years because from the perspective of there is not a willingness in a lot of cases. I'm going back to the operators. I don't believe there's a willingness to do things they weren't meant to do. Right. I think there is a logistics issue with contractors and subcontractors being given jobs. It's difficult to manage at scale. I think there's an element of, once it's installed and you've got somebody connected, code powers takes its course. That's another thing. I think there's a debate over what needs a way leave and what needs permission. That's the other thing that has always been a topic of debate of if it's less than a certain number of people living in a block of flats and I'm going to connect them from an external pole, should I need the requirement and the permission of the landlord? I think for golden thread purposes, you probably should,
Yeah, because masonette blocks fall into that category, don't they? They're not like a block of flats as you'd conventionally have. You could drill holes into them. They're typically not above 11 metres in height, but you'd probably want some form of auditing and some form of trail to know who's where and things.
Exactly, and that's all it is, Chris. It goes back to a trail of information. It always goes back to golden thread of who's been in your building, when have they been in the building, what have they done to the building.
Yeah.
And without that information, best will of the world, how is a landlord, if they weren't even aware that somebody had come to their building, can they keep track of any issues that arise, or if somebody needs to go back? It's even, simple examples like permits to dig. That's another area of debate that goes around and one landlord had it recently, somebody's dug up the patio or dug up the driveway, somebody trips and falls, actually finding out who did that work without a trail of documentation or a trail of information. You're chasing your tail trying to find out, what happened, when it happened, and who do you contact to put it right. So yeah, it's always been a problem, and I think it will always continue to be a problem. I don't think there's a solution to it. The only thing that landlords can do, which the ones we work with are very good at, is just informing property managers, the people that are actually on site. If you see somebody in a building or outside a building, just flag it to the right people and say, look, have they got permission to be doing this? Should they be doing it? What are they doing? And I think at that level, you need the people on the ground aware of the message, that don't just take it for granted that because somebody's got something on your particular building or somebody's turned up on your building, they've got the right to be there or they've got permission. I think that's the key message. And they might well do, but it's always worth checking.
So now we've got the very serious question out of the way. So you work across the country with multiple landlords and telco providers. How do you manage all of that information, and how does that support your decision making?
Yeah, really good question, Chris. So the thing that kind of ties the provider world together is UPRNs. So national UPRNs, I should clarify, which I come on to in a sec. So they run their data and their data sets all off UPRNs. When I say it's a unique property reference. So for us, it was always key to have the UPRNs for buildings and the units within those buildings, because without it, you cannot communicate with a provider, essentially, because that you can give them a postcode or you can give them a building name. It's not the language that they speak. Ironically, on the other side of the house with landlords, they all have some very, very good data, some less good data based on systems, etc. But a really common theme that I found is that UPRNs, if I say to a landlord, do you have UPRNs for your estate? More often than not, they'll say yes. And when they provide the UPRNs, it's not the national UPRN, it is their own unique property reference, which, makes complete sense, because they want a system that they can track their own buildings through. But it's that interesting middle ground between having a common data set that both landlords and providers can come together and go, I'm talking about this. Because if you're talking about this over here and they're talking about this over here, that's when you get into a confused relationship of what we're actually requesting. So that's just one example of, UPRNs are a really interesting one. And I think it's become more apparent, especially with landlords in today's age, as funding applications go in for things like social housing decarbonisation fund and applications and grants, that a lot of the requests are coming for national UPRNs. And I think there is not a rush, but I think there's a sudden realization that although they've got their own UPRNs, I think a lot of projects are underway in different ways to get the national UPRNs allocated to their data sets. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is just one example of
so that's
where
kind
you
of,
see.
So it's going to kind of be a two-parter. So one challenge is obviously, so it's around how do you process everything coming in. So with the landlord, they were sending you a list of what they thought were UPRNs but were asset refs. The telcos are only talking in national UPRNs. And so there was that middle ground in the middle where you would have to do the translation. How does that work at CTG when you do your middle translation? And then how are you able to kind of understand that data from both telcos and landlords?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, Chris, as you know, data was never my strong point. As such, you used to produce it along with many others. From our side, it was a lot about the GIS side as well. So what we wanted to do, and Chris was a key part of this, was we would get different formats of stock lists, and it would be a case of, more often than not, it would be the question you asked as to what stock list you received, because there are different versions. So sometimes you get the maintenance rights one, sometimes you get a stock of when they were built, sometimes you get the asbestos records or vulnerable persons list, and they're all in different spreadsheets. I think it's the way that they pull it from their reports. So you've got to be quite careful on what you're actually asking for. And that's where a good relationship with landlords helps you to then introduce people like yourself and the various other data people that CTG has and had to work with the landlord to put it into at least a format that you guys could work your magic on to get it into a format that would work for not just CTG, but to give it back to the landlord in a useful format once you've done the work, and then also use it for providers. So I think it's a win-win. They like the term win-win-win, but I'll say it here is that although there is a bit of pain in that middle ground of saying, can you provide me a stock list? But on the back of it, there's going to be some questions fired back. I think if you can work together, there's a huge benefit to all parties once you've got it in a format that is easy and common sense middle ground to understand. And I think that's where we were pretty good, and you took a lot of credit for it, because once you got to that point, and I know we'll come on to this, is you can then use that data and then convert it into something that's really, really interesting. So it's all well and good just going, yeah, brilliant, we've now worked out the UPRN thing. Well, what can we actually do with it now that we've got it?
I think one of the big challenges that we had, because obviously as landlords, you will lease some stock from others or you'll lease to other landlords. So when we're looking at this data, quite often what the telcos traditionally do is they'll take a stock list as given and go, okay, this is a building, this is a home, and they'll keep all that information separate. But when we were processing that, we couldn't just assume it was all separate, because what happens if Housing Association 1 leased the whole block of flats but didn't have maintenance rights, and they viewed it as just one building, but Housing Association 2 considered it as 3 buildings. So that affects how you do your way leaves and all of that. So that was the real challenge as your data team, how to process that so you could look at a single address and go, okay, who owns this building? Okay, it's Housing Association 2. Housing Association 1 leases it. So we don't need to get a way leave from Housing Association 1, we can just go straight to 2. Now GIS, obviously me being a geospatial nut, I wanted to stick everything on a map.
Mm-hmm.
So when we put everything onto a map for you, can you tell kind of the audience what was on that map? So obviously landlord stock lists were one of them, and the numerous and prospective landlords that we're working with. What else went onto that map?
Yeah, so thankfully, Chris, you were there to do all of this. from the basic side, you'd have land reg, pulling in data from there. You then go to various third parties, so think broadband, etc., and get network information from there. And there were bits of data that came across there, and I'm sure you could tell me a million times over more information about it. But the end result basically was you could have a visualization of not just one housing association stock, which in itself is hugely valuable to some housing associations. Some don't. They just have a spreadsheet. And I think having a visualization of your stock, locations, being able to interact with it, clicking on a building, tell you the long and the lat, but how many units are in there, whether it's freehold, all of that good stuff. I mean, that in itself is hugely valuable. Now, we used it for a really boring purpose and still use it for a boring purpose to your audience anyway. And it was basically to use it for fibre, to understand if a housing association has stock all down the south coast in different locations, how many operators have network over those buildings? Are we talking about one provider just because that's the location, or were there 3, 4, 5 providers that overbuilt each other in that particular area, right? So that was really useful information to us because we could understand, right, has this landlord, are they going to get bombarded with wavy requests? Are they going to have people trying to get into the same MDUs? All of that information was hugely valuable and still is. But for me, it was at the point you show that to landlords is the recognition of, well, that's really useful and really, really helpful. But what you could actually do with it and extend it to use it for, that's the bit that really interested me. And that's the bit we were working on, weren't we, Chris, as to how you can evolve it from outside of a simple, you've got X number of buildings in this location and I can click on it and brilliant. And this is the fibre providers. But can you tell me more about, have I got customer complaint hotspots? Have I got a particular section of vulnerable residents? Have I got, an area that's not going to have fibre for the next 5 years? Am I going to, the world was endless around that. And that's the bit.
Switch off was the other big one, wasn't it? How it's supporting landlords with their copper switch off timelines.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was and still is a really useful exercise because obviously you get produced the phases of the switch off and you can add the phases onto that map so you can show them visually, what areas can be concentrated on. So yeah, there was a really, really interesting use case for us. And you obviously did a brilliant job in developing that for us, and is still in use today. It's just the evolution of where for landlords it could be used in different spaces. And there was a few landlords that we showed it to, and suddenly I think there was a lot of interest from other areas of the business that said, actually, this would be incredibly helpful. And it ranged from, teams that were looking after the nature and, parks and all of that sort of stuff. And you had others that were just interested in high risk buildings, so highlighting high risk buildings and their locations. There was so many different departments that went, I get the actual value of this.
Because that was one of the big things, because I don't think we've mentioned it, but there was a report done the other year that social landlord MDUs are typically behind fibre rollout, aren't they? So one of the things that we wanted to do, which is purchase some building data so we could identify buildings which were taller than 18 metres and 11 metres, and then we could flag that on a map and identify where there was no fibre connectivity. And it was like, could we encourage a telco to go to that area?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it was also about, and still is the aim, Chris, in a lot of ways, which I'll come on to in a sec, is that the idea was to collaborate between landlords. So if there was an agreement, 2 landlords relatively close together, you're bound to have stock that crosses over, whether you transfer stock or buy stock or sell stock, or you just happen to have buildings in the same areas. It was to be able to have a combined approach to how you dealt with things like fibre rollouts. But it wasn't just fibre rollouts. It just happens that was and is our world. Yeah. So yeah, it's great for collaboration and showing landlords that, if you're happy to share data, collaborate together, you can have a full stock of where everything is, what the benefits are, what you want to understand from your stock, all in a interactive way.
I think that kind of ties in. We've kind of half answered that, but I was going to ask, what would you like to see in the future with housing groups when it comes to utilising geospatial information? Obviously, you've talked about sharing services. Was there any other thoughts that you had in mind?
I think I would throw the question back to landlords. I've really, honestly, time is for me a key aspect of this. Is finding time to sit down with various landlords, anyone welcome, CTG clients or not, and have a discussion around on this GIS basis. What information to you is priority? What would you like to see from it? Now, we can deliver you something as basic as these are your buildings on a map. But if there are specific things that you want to collaborate together with us on, or as a wider group, what are those priorities? And half the problem for landlords is that legislation keeps coming in and new regulations and new points of this is now the hot topic. Well, how can GIS support you in understanding where you've got a problem or where there's potentially an issue or whatever the particular main issue of today is? What would you as a group like for us to develop and work together on? That's what I'd like.
Well, interestingly, I don't know if you know this or if anyone else. There's a group in the Northeast. It's called Shine Social Housing in the Northeast, and they have a product called One Map, and it's all their stock information. It's got community maps. It's got all sorts, and it's exactly that sort of thing. They've all come up with a list of priorities. And they've been able to map it, and they're able to share resource to deliver those objectives.
That's brilliant.
And yeah, that sort of thing I love. I think that's brilliant.
And do you know, Chris, it's great to see examples of it. And if we were the ones that could start something like that and have a roundtable, brilliant. If it was you in your business, brilliant. We'd love to be a part of it. But and it may all be happening, but it just feels like it's happening in small pockets.
Yeah,
and I think
I think that's what it is. It's those small pockets, small bits, and there's another organisation called the Open Data Exchange which wants to do a very similar thing, just roll it out nationally. Understand every single home, where is it on a map, where's their shared services. It's really interesting. We're coming up to our final question now, which is it's sort of become a parcel of normal now. I've kind of got to stop saying it's happening. If you had an unlimited budget in your world, what would you want to do with it?
I think unlimited budget and time, probably, Chris, time probably would be the main one. I think from our position as CTG anyway, is that we've built up relationships with a number of landlords over many years. And for us, we get asked a lot of questions about, can you help with X, Y, Z? And that ranges from, in our audit, we'll notify them of an issue that's nothing to do with a fibre installation. It might just be to do with stuff that's found in a riser cupboard that belongs to residents, or it might be that, the fire stopping of another separate installation isn't quite right. And we'll say, okay, brilliant. Here's a report. Somebody should go out and fix that. And then they say, well, can you fix that on our behalf? That's at the very, basic level, all the way up to, EV charging, through to GIS, through to digital twins, through to all the good stuff that we as a business could be doing. And I think it's a case of, if I had unlimited time stroke budget, it goes a bit back to what I was saying about the GIS. It's to sit in a round table with the landlords that we work with and anyone that's interested and say, look, from our perspective, we can take this in the direction that you would like to take it. What would you like us to offer as a service on top of what we already do? So we stepped foot into energy monitoring because we were getting quite a lot of requests about that, and that's now rolling out. It's where we as a business could support landlords. What is the top priority next? And I think for me, if I could get the time and then off the back of that, the budget to do some scoping, to do some pilots, to find right partners if it's necessary, because we are not the experts in everything, to find the right partners to then come along and deliver some solutions. So time to do that, and time to properly have a round table and do the findings and do the follow-ups and all that good stuff, and then the budget off the back of that to then go, right, what should we be doing from here? So yeah, that's my ideal world, Chris.
That sounds like a pretty brilliant way to use an unlimited budget, in all
Well,
honesty.
yeah.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been brilliant having you on. If anyone wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to do so?
It's completely up to you. So either my number or I can put it in the email chat after this, Chris, whatever you'd like to.
Yeah, so what we'll do is obviously on our LinkedIn post, I'll tie you into it, but on the description on the podcasts and everything else, I can put in your email there as well.
Yeah, perfect. Drop me an email. I'll pop it across.
Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to get involved in the podcast, please feel free to get in touch. Again, you can find us either on our LinkedIn or on our website of www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. Thank you so much and catch you next time. Cheers, Tony.
Thanks. Cheers, Chris.